Hi, and welcome to week 3, Understanding Old Testament Narrative Part 2. I'm excited about this week. We're going to move into really allowing you to do your own narrative evaluation and analysis, or what we might call narrative criticism. So our goals this week are to analyze the narrative components of plot, dialogue, time, and characterization in a narrative text, and then to create a personal interpretive methodology for biblical historical narrative, and finally to analyze the sacrifice of Isaac and apply the hermeneutical meaning to a contemporary situation, which is really the goal of this course. The whole idea of how do I better understand what God intended when he inspired the author to write about an event. So the sacrifice of Isaac is a historical narrative, and one could say, well, God's just telling us about the past, and yet the Bible has a brevity to it in that everything we're told, we are told for a reason. And we want to understand the exegetical meaning, in other words, what God is saying, the hermeneutical meaning, how we apply that, and then finally, how do we apply that to a contemporary situation? So with that in mind, we have a rather in-depth, longer paper, 4+ page narrative paper, and then a discussion post. On the narrative paper, I am really looking for full research. And so as you explore it, well, let me just tell you about the assignment first, and then we'll dive into kind of what I'm looking for. So assignment 3.1 is a narrative analysis of the sacrifice of Isaac. And it's applying the information you learned in Folkelman's book. Complete a 4-page narrative analysis of Genesis 22, verses 1 to 24. Now, I am looking for so much more than just an overview of the plot. Now, an overview of the plot is a component, but I'm really wanting you to dive into what is the narrative? What are we told in dialogue? Why did God give us this dialogue? Why is the interchange between Abraham and Isaac significant? What does each one say to the other? Is it factually accurate? Which is building on last week. We know that God is omnipotent, all-powerful. We know that he is omnipresent. We know that he knows all things. But when we explore this text critically, it makes it sound as though God does not know all things. And so what do we do with that? What do we do with how Moses was inspired to convey this story? And what do we do with a narrator who tells us that God doesn't know the outcome? How do we work with that? And so this narrative analysis is really a theological paper as well, in that I want you to really wrestle with why the narrator is telling us what the narrator is telling us. So be sure to include a discussion of the various aspects of plot, character development, which characters are full, which characters are flat, meaning which ones are developed, which ones are not developed, and the ones that are not developed, are they agents? In other words, they're just there to hold something, or is there another reason? And so why is the author developing different characters the way they are? I want to understand the use of time, and in many ways, I like this narrative because it's almost like a movie scene. For the use of time, think about what is time? How do we convey time in a narrative or in a story? And we do it first through verbs. Verbs are the action part of a narrative. So if you turn this story from written word into kind of a screenplay, what pieces move fast? What pieces move slow? How do we know that they're moving fast? Are we skipping from one scene to another scene and they've moved 1,000 miles? I mean, so this whole idea of time, how does the author manipulate time through the writing? Dialogue, what are people saying? Why are they saying it? So all of these components are really important to tearing apart a narrative that God has given us and trying to understand how it was crafted and why it was crafted in the way it was. Please note the example of narrative analysis provided in the course lecture, the use of plot, character development, dialogue, and a narrative text. This paper should not only have references to the Bible and references to Folkelman, but it should also include some outside research where you have looked to other scholars and included quotes from them or at least references to them in your paper. Always include a bibliography, an introduction, and a conclusion summarizing what you've learned. I think in this paper, bringing it to a modern context is something else that I'll be expecting in your conclusion, which is you've done all of your analysis, you've tried to dig deeper into understanding why God has given us this story, and then hopefully you have used this as a trajectory through the rest of the Old Testament and perhaps even into the New Testament to tell me how this story is relevant to Christ and the story of Jesus, or narrative of Jesus, and then ultimately what we can take away into our modern lives as an application of this narrative. So next we have a discussion post where I want you to explain the purpose of the test in Genesis 22, which begins after these things, God tested Abraham. The narrative concludes with, "For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Well, if you pair the beginning and the end of this passage, which should be the introduction and the conclusion, basically telling us what is the point, it sounds like the point of this story is after these things, in other words, referring to Genesis 21 and before, God tested Abraham. Well, the reason why you test someone is you don't know if they know what you're talking about. So is God saying, I don't know how you're going to respond, but here's a test. And then at the end, hey, you passed the test. Now I, God, know that you fear God. Well, is that the case? Did God not know the outcome? Well, some theological positions use this as a proof text that in fact God doesn't know. God sets things in motion. He thinks he knows how they might come out, but he's not 100% sure. And so he tested Abraham. Well, most evangelical thought would say that's not the case. Moody, for instance, would say that's not the case. So how do you wrestle with this idea? And for this post, I am also looking for some outside research. What have others said about Genesis 22 and its relationship to God's all-knowingness? So this sounds like God did not know whether Abraham would sacrifice his son or not. What do you think about it, and how do you document that discussion? I'm sure that everyone is going to say, well, of course God knew, but why do you say that? And that's one of the things in week one I kind of gave a pass to folks a little bit, which is that they could state an evangelical position and then move on. Well, here, if you say that God knew, why do you say that? What do you rely upon that says that God knew? And if you can document in the Bible and through outside research, others that agree with that position support it, and then argue, why did God say these words? And use an academic thought. And then also bring in your own personal wrestling or discussion or thoughts as well. So in your opinion, and opinion means your researched opinion, what is the purpose of the test of Abraham? Because the core of Genesis 22 is a test. So what is the purpose of that test? Did God know the outcome in advance? And be sure to support your evidence or your answer with academic evidence and biblical support. So those are our two assignments this week. Like always, your first post is due on Friday with ongoing engagement over the weekend. And I have to say that the class is doing really well with that. I've enjoyed some of the conversations that I've had with a few of the students so far, and I look forward to more of that through our semester. Please put your name in the file name of assignments as you upload them. Call me or email me with any questions. This week I will be in Antigua until Sunday morning, and then I'm flying back to the U.S. and I'll be in Raleigh, North Carolina towards the end of the week and into next week. So have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.